At 4 in the morning, Marin Kowalczyk had already worked through 3 batches of dough in the bakery her own mother had built, and she was still told she was slow. In a shop that carried her family's name, she had no name of her own. They called her the night girl. Her stepmother said the names of the dead stay in the ground with them. And her father, a man still living, still sitting 3 feet away with his newspaper, had not spoken his daughter's name in 8 years. She baked bread for all of Locust Point and was forbidden to eat any of it. She stood outside the back door until closing time, for the crime of answering a customer who had asked her name. What Marin did not know was that 3 people had come to that door asking for her by name, and all 3 had been turned away with lies prepared in advance. She moved to Philadelphia. She is unwell. She is promised to a family in Boston. 2 letters written to her had burned down to ash in a tin box under a bed. Then one October afternoon she carried the trash out the back and passed the man in the wheelchair at the end of the street, the man who had been sitting there 4 months without a single person asking his name. She handed him a loaf still warm from the oven and said the same 5 words her mother used to say, "Take it. Don't tell anybody." She did not know she had just spoken the password to her own life. She did not know that man had been sitting there 4 months waiting for exactly those 5 words. And she could never have guessed that 3 weeks later, her own family would sign a $500 piece of paper to push her out of their lives for good, never realizing that with that one signature, they had opened the very thing her dead mother had kept hidden for 8 long years. If you believe kindness always finds its way back, tap the like button so this story can reach further. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And subscribe, so you can walk through the rest of these stories with us. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the bakery's front door opened, and the smell of fresh baked dough spilled out onto the sidewalk just as it did every day. The neighborhood children were already lined up outside, coins clenched tightly in their small hands, because every one of them knew that Tuesday was honey bread day. They laughed, they jostled one another, they called Danika's name at the front counter, and not a single child knew that the person who had been awake since 3 o'clock that morning baking those loaves was standing behind the wall that separated the kitchen from the shop, flour still clinging to her hands, forbidden to step outside. At 7 o'clock, when the line had finally thinned, Beatrix opened the inventory ledger and began counting with the tip of her pencil. She counted slowly, counted twice, then tapped the pencil against the counter 3 times. Danica came in from the front, wiping her hands on her apron, and asked her mother what was wrong. Beatrix said 1 loaf was missing. Danica stayed silent for exactly 1 beat, then said the thing she'd been holding inside since the previous afternoon, that she'd seen Marin go out into the back alley, and Marin had been gone far longer than it took to empty a trash bin. Beatrix didn't ask another question. She walked straight into the kitchen. Marin was lifting the final batch of bread from the oven, her face flushed from the heat, and she heard her stepmother's footsteps before she heard her voice. Beatrix asked where the loaf was. Marin set the tray down, removed her oven mitts, and answered that she'd given the loaf away. Beatrix asked who she'd given it to. Marin said someone at the end of the street. Beatrix asked which person. Marin said she didn't know his name. Beatrix gave a very short laugh, a laugh with nothing inside it, then said that apparently someone in this house now believed she had the right to hand out charity. Marin said she'd baked that loaf with her own hands. Beatrix said she'd baked it with Beatrix's flour. Marin said she'd baked it using her mother's recipe. The words fell into the middle of the kitchen and lay there, motionless. Beatrix stepped 1 pace closer, her voice still never rising, and said that people who were already in the ground didn't own anything anymore. Not recipes, not even the name painted on the sign outside. Marin said her mother's name was still on that sign. Beatrix said signs faded, and she was the one who paid to have them repainted. Marin said paint could cover letters, but it couldn't cover an oven. Beatrix asked what the oven had to do with anything. Marin said her mother had bought that oven with her own money, and the crack in the corner of its door was something her mother had made, and every time the weather turned cold, a rag had to be wedged into that crack, and there was only 1 person left in this house who still knew exactly where that rag belonged. Beatrix was silent for longer than necessary. Then, she said that from that day forward, Marin wasn't allowed to step into the back alley again. Marin asked who was supposed to take out the trash. Beatrix said Danica would do it. Danica, standing in the doorway, said she wasn't touching the trash bin. Beatrix said then she'd hire someone, and she said it while still looking directly at Marin, so both of them would understand that she'd rather spend money than let Marin walk into that alley 1 more time. Marin asked what she was afraid of in an alley. Beatrix said she wasn't afraid of anything. She simply didn't like doors when she couldn't see what was on the other side. In the front room, exactly 3 meters from where they stood, Piotr sat in his usual chair, with the newspaper spread open in front of him. He'd heard everything from the beginning. He hadn't turned a single page for the past 4 minutes. Beatrix turned toward him and asked whether he had anything to say. Piotr didn't look up. He said the girl had been talking too much lately. Marin looked toward the newspaper, looked at her father's 2 hands gripping its edges, and waited for him to lower it. He didn't. She said, "Papa." He didn't answer. She said, "Papa," 1 more time, and Beatrix cut in, saying he was busy. Marin said he was reading the sports page, and he'd already read that page yesterday. Piotr turned a page. Beatrix told Marin to get back to the oven because the dark bread still hadn't gone in. Marin turned away. She walked past her father close enough to touch his shoulder if she'd wanted to, and she didn't touch him. At the kitchen door, she stopped, and she told his back that the loaf she'd given away was the one with the burned edge, the kind this family threw out every single day, and no one had lost anything. Beatrix said what had been lost wasn't in the loaf. Marin asked where it was then. Beatrix said it was in the fact that someone in this house had started making decisions for herself. Marin didn't answer that. She put on her oven mitts, opened the oven door, and wedged the rag into the corner the way her mother had once taught her. At noon that same day, when Beatrix went to the bank, Marin picked up the trash bin and carried it into the back alley. She knew she'd just been forbidden to go there. She went anyway. The back alley was about 20 paces long, and Marin walked every one of those 20 paces with the trash bin in her right hand and a loaf with a burned edge hidden beneath her apron. She set the bin down, then walked another 40 paces to the end of the street, to the red brick wall where the man was still sitting. He didn't turn around when he heard her footsteps. He only said that she was walking more slowly today than she had yesterday. Marin said that was because today she'd been forbidden to come out here. He asked what you called it when someone was forbidden to go somewhere and went anyway. She said you called it going. She held out the loaf. He didn't reach for it right away. He studied it for quite a while, looking at the dark burned edge and the crust split lengthwise along the back of the loaf, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He bent down and smelled it. Then he said this bread had been allowed to rise longer than the usual recipe called for, at least more than 3 hours, and whoever had taught her to do that had done it deliberately, not because they'd forgotten about the dough. Marin stood perfectly still. In 8 years, not one person in that bakery had ever spoken about letting the dough rise that long. Beatrix called it a waste of time. Danica had never even asked. The entire Locust Point neighborhood had eaten her mother's bread for more than 10 years without anyone ever knowing why those loaves smelled different, and now a man in a wheelchair at the end of the street had identified it after smelling the bread once. She asked how he knew. He said he didn't know, he only remembered. She asked where he remembered it from. He said from a place it wasn't time to talk about yet. Marin said every answer he gave went in circles. He said going in circles was how people protected an answer, until it was solid enough to stand on its own. She asked who he was. He said he was a story that wasn't ready to be read yet. She said she wasn't asking what kind of story he was. She was asking his name. He said the name was part of the story too, and that part came close to the end. Marin said if someone was feeding him, then at the very least that person had the right to know who she was feeding. He said that was true, and he would answer her, but not today. She asked what day then. He said the day she no longer had to hide a loaf of bread beneath her apron. Marin was quiet for a while. Then she sat down on the step across from him, about 2 paces away, and asked how long he'd been sitting there. He said 4 months. She asked what he'd been doing for 4 months. He said counting. She asked what he counted. He said the things people didn't think anyone was counting. She asked for an example. He said, for example, the bakery kitchen light came on at 3:15 in the morning and went off at 7 o'clock, regularly, 6 days a week, except on Sundays, when it came on at 4 o'clock. Marin said he'd been counting her working hours. He said he'd been counting the working hours of one person, and in 4 months that person hadn't stepped out to the front counter even once. She said he sat out on the street and still knew what happened inside. He said walls heard a great deal, they simply didn't say anything. She asked what about him. He said he was a wall too, until the day he wasn't. Marin said he talked like an old schoolmaster. He said people who sat still for a long time learned many things that people who were always standing never had time to notice. She asked if he sat here for so long, where did he sleep at night? He said he slept somewhere the noise couldn't reach him. She said everywhere in this neighborhood was noisy. He said then both of them were outsiders. Marin said she was inside. He said being inside while never being allowed to step out to the front counter was only another way of being outside. She stood up before he could say anything more, because she knew that if she sat there for another 2 minutes, she was going to cry. And she hadn't cried in front of anyone for 8 years. On the way back, she passed the small parking lot at the corner of the street, where Mr. Halloran still collected monthly parking fees, and he was fastening a price sign back into place after the wind had torn it loose. Marin stopped and asked whether the spot at the end of the street cost money, because she thought that if it did, someone might drive the man away before winter arrived. Mr. Halloran said it did. She asked why he hadn't made him leave then. He said because somebody had already paid for it. Marin asked how much. He said the entire winter had been paid for, all at once, in cash, and it had been paid back in June. She asked who had paid. Mr. Halloran shrugged and said he didn't know. The person who brought the money had been a young man in a dark coat, driving a black car. He'd handed over the money and left without giving a name, saying only one thing, that the spot was to remain exactly as it was, and no one else was to be allowed to park there. Marin asked whether he thought that was strange. Mr. Halloran said he was in the business of collecting money for parking spaces, and in that business cash was never strange. The only strange thing was someone refusing to take it. Marin walked back to the bakery, and the entire way she couldn't stop thinking about one very simple thing she couldn't seem to arrange neatly inside her mind, that a beggar didn't have someone paying for the place where he sat, and if he did, then he wasn't a beggar. 3 days later, at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, a black car pulled up in front of the bakery, and a man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a sheet of paper folded in half in the other. He didn't look at the price board on the wall, and he didn't look at the pastry case. He looked straight at Danica behind the front counter and asked whether this was the Kowalczyk family's bakery. Danica said it was. He unfolded the paper, read from it, then asked whether he could speak with Marin Kowalczyk. Danica stood still a little too long. Beatrix came out from the back, wiping her hands, smiling with only as much of her mouth as was necessary, and asked who he was. He said his name was Cormac Delaney, that he was an attorney, and that he'd come regarding a private matter. Beatrix said she handled the private matters of this family. Delaney said this matter didn't belong to the family. Beatrix asked whose matter it was, then. Delaney said the name was written on the paper in his hand. Beatrix said the girl was sick. Delaney asked how long she'd been sick. Beatrix said for the past few days. Delaney asked how many days a few meant. Beatrix said he was asking an awful lot of questions. Delaney said that was his profession. Beatrix said in that case he was welcome to sit down, and she pushed Danica forward, introducing her as her daughter, the person who managed the entire bakery, the person who knew everything that happened in this house. Delaney nodded to Danica with perfect courtesy and asked whether her name was Marin. Danica said no. Delaney said then he still hadn't met the person he'd come to see. Beatrix said he could leave a message. Delaney said he never left messages, because messages had to pass through someone else's hands, and he preferred things that traveled directly. Beatrix sat down across from him and began talking about the season, about the price of flour that year, about how this bakery had stood on the corner in Locust Point for 30 years. Delaney listened. He didn't interrupt her once. Then he asked, during those 30 years, who was the earliest one to rise? Beatrix said everyone in the family got up early. Delaney asked how many people everyone meant. Beatrix said 4. Delaney asked, with 4 people, what time the oven was turned on. Beatrix said around 5 o'clock. Delaney wrote a single word in the small notebook, resting on his knee. At that exact moment, Beatrix called toward the back and told someone to bring out the coffee, and Marin walked in carrying a tray, her hair still tied low, flour still dusting her apron, her face showing absolutely nothing that could have been called illness. Delaney looked up. He didn't ask Beatrix anything. He asked Marin directly what her name was. Marin set the tray down. She said Marin. Delaney asked Marin what. She said Marin Kowalczyk. Delaney opened his notebook and wrote it down. Beatrix said the girl had only recovered that morning. Delaney said in that case heaven had worked very quickly. Beatrix said God often did. Delaney said God often did, while people rarely did. He turned back to Marin and asked what she did in the bakery. Marin said she baked bread. He asked what time she started baking. She said 3 o'clock. Beatrix said 5 o'clock. Both answers fell into the room at the same moment. Delaney didn't look at either of them. He simply wrote another line in his notebook. Then he asked Marin whether she often came out to the front counter. Beatrix answered for her, saying the girl didn't like crowds. Delaney said he hadn't asked her. Beatrix said the girl was shy. Delaney said shy people didn't usually state their own names that clearly. Danica, standing at the corner of the counter, looked at her mother and then lowered her eyes to the floor. Delaney asked Marin one final question, whether anyone had come there looking for her during the past 6 months. Marin said no. Delaney asked if she was certain. Marin said she was certain, because no one had ever come looking for her. Delaney looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than politeness allowed, then closed his notebook. Beatrix invited him to have more bread. Delaney said his 11 minutes were over. Beatrix said he'd only been sitting there a little while. Delaney said a little while was enough, because the beginning always told him what the ending was going to be. Beatrix asked what that was supposed to mean. Delaney said it meant he didn't need to stay until the end of a meal to know what had been served. He stood, buttoned his jacket, thanked them for the coffee, and directed the thanks to Marin, rather than Beatrix. Beatrix said the girl hadn't even made it. Delaney said carrying it out was enough for him. When he reached the door, he stopped, turned halfway around, and told Beatrix that he'd be coming back. Beatrix asked what he'd be coming back for. Delaney said to see whether the ending matched the one he'd already guessed. Then he left. The black car moved slowly past the end of the street, more slowly than necessary, before finally picking up speed. Inside the bakery, Beatrix stood watching it for a very long time. Danica asked her mother who he was. Beatrix said no one. Danica said he'd written Marin's name in his notebook. Beatrix said people wrote all kinds of things in notebooks. Danica said he'd sat there for 11 minutes and left without buying anything. Beatrix said all the better. This bakery wasn't short on customers. Then she turned toward the back, and her voice changed completely as she told Marin to put the tray away, and told her that from now on, whenever customers came in, she was to stay in the kitchen and not step outside. Marin asked why. Beatrix said because she'd said so. Marin said he asked my name. Beatrix said a stranger asking someone's name didn't mean anything. Marin said then why are you afraid? Beatrix turned around, and for the first time in many months, she didn't have an answer ready. That afternoon, Danica said nothing at all, and her silence lasted until the exact moment Beatrix sat down to count the money from the register. Only then did she begin, very slowly and very carefully, by asking whether her mother had noticed which direction that lawyer had been looking. Beatrix asked, which direction? Danica said toward the tray. Beatrix asked what was so important about the tray. Danica said there was nothing important about the tray, but the person carrying it had walked out at exactly the moment her mother was talking, had stood exactly where the customer would have to look, and had answered before anyone was even supposed to be asking her anything. Beatrix set the money down. She called Marin out. Marin came, still holding a cleaning cloth in one hand. Beatrix asked who had told her to bring out the coffee. Marin said you did. Beatrix said she'd told her to bring out the coffee, not to bring herself out and stand in the middle of the room. Marin said she'd put the tray down and stayed because someone had asked her a question. Beatrix said when someone asked her something, she was supposed to lower her eyes. Marin said she had lowered them. Beatrix said she'd lowered her eyes and still managed to give both her first name and her last name. Marin said when someone asked for her full name, she gave her full name. Danica cut in and said that Marin had given a different time for when the oven was turned on than the time their mother had given. Marin said that was because she was the one who turned on the oven. Beatrix said the mistake wasn't in the time. Marin asked where it was then. Beatrix said it was in the fact that there was only supposed to be one mouth in this house that answered outsiders, and that mouth wasn't hers. Then she pointed toward the back door and told Marin to stand outside until closing time. Marin asked, what about the batch of dark bread for that evening? Beatrix said throw it away. Marin said if they threw it away, there'd be nothing to sell tomorrow. Beatrix said they'd deal with tomorrow when it came. Marin said the dough had been rising since noon. Beatrix said then let it spoil, and consider it an expensive lesson for someone who liked making decisions for herself. Marin stood outside the back door from 4 o'clock that afternoon. October came quickly to darkness in Locust Point, and the wind blew up from the harbor and pushed backward through the alley, and she stood there listening to the bell over the front door ring more than a dozen times, listening to Danica greet customers, listening to the cash register, and thinking about one very small thing, that among all those sounds, not a single one belonged to her, while everything the customers were buying had been made by her hands. Around 7 o'clock, the back door opened. Pyotr stepped outside carrying a basin of dirty water from washing the trays. He saw his daughter standing there. He stopped. He set the basin down. He looked at her for a very long time. And Marin looked back. And in that exact moment she saw his mouth open, saw his chin move, saw him draw breath as if he were about to say something, and she stood absolutely still because she was afraid that if she moved even a little, whatever sentence he'd gathered inside himself would disappear. Then, from inside the house, Beatrix called his name. Just once. Pyotr closed his mouth. He bent down, picked up the basin, emptied the water, then turned and went back inside. The door closed. Marin remained in the same place for another 2 hours, and she didn't cry, because she'd learned that a sentence swallowed before it was spoken could hurt more than one that was actually said aloud. At 9 o'clock, the bakery closed, and Beatrix allowed her to come inside. Marin went into the kitchen, swept, wiped everything down, then went to get the broom from the storage room in the back, where the tools were kept, along with the old metal cabinet her mother had once used for bookkeeping. The storage room light had been broken for a long time, so Marin turned on the flashlight on Danika's phone, which she'd borrowed for a moment while she searched, and the beam swept across the cabinet door. The door was slightly open. Inside, standing upright, were 3 metal document boxes. 2 had printed labels. The third had a strip of yellowed paper tape stuck across it, and on that strip was handwriting Marin recognized immediately. Handwriting that leaned slightly to the left, with the tail of the letter K drawn long, the same handwriting that had written recipes on the side of the oven throughout her entire childhood. 3 characters were written on the label. H-K-O-L-X-E. Marin froze where she stood. She hadn't even had time to step closer when she heard footsteps behind her. Beatrix was standing in the storage room doorway, a ring of keys in her hand. She asked what Marin was looking for. Marin said the broom. Beatrix said the broom was hanging on the other wall. Marin said she hadn't seen it. Beatrix walked past her, closed the cabinet door, inserted a key, and turned the lock. The sound was clean and sharp. Then she pulled the key out, slipped it into the pocket of her apron, and said there were places in this house that didn't need anyone cleaning them. Marin asked what was inside the cabinet. Beatrix said papers. Marin asked whose papers. Beatrix said the papers belonged to the person who paid the electric bill. Marin said her mother's name was on the box. Beatrix said there was 1 initial and 1 last name on that box, and all 4 people in this house carried that last name. Marin said the initial was H. Beatrix asked what difference that made. Marin said no one else in this house had a name beginning with H. Beatrix was silent for exactly 1 beat, a very short beat. But Marin had lived with this woman for 8 years, and she knew what that beat meant. Then Beatrix said the cabinet lock was broken, that it sometimes popped open on its own, and that tomorrow she'd call someone to replace it. Marin said tomorrow was Sunday. Beatrix said then Monday. She turned off the storage room light and stood waiting until Marin walked out first, then followed behind her. And during that short walk from the storage room back to the kitchen, Marin listened to the keys in her stepmother's apron pocket clicking against one another with every step, and she counted 7 of them. On Sunday morning, the bakery opened an hour later than usual, and when Marin carried the crate of empty bottles out to the curb, she saw Ozzie Brennan sitting on the steps of the refrigerated warehouse across the street, drinking coffee from a paper cup that had clearly been reused many times. He was 66 years old, had worked as a security guard at that cold storage warehouse for 9 years, and in all those 9 years, he'd never once called Marin the night shift girl. She crossed the street and greeted him. He asked how late she'd been made to stand outside the back door on Friday. Marin asked if he'd seen her. He said when he sat there, he saw everything. She said then he must have seen a great many things. Ozzie set his coffee cup down on the step and said he didn't just see things, he wrote them down. Then he pulled a hard-covered notebook from his coat pocket, the kind of squared ledger notebook warehouse workers used, its edges frayed, and all 4 corners worn round with age. He didn't open it right away. He held it on his lap and asked whether anyone had ever come to the bakery asking for her by name. Marin said there'd been a lawyer on Friday. Ozzie said he was the 3rd one. Marin said she didn't understand. Ozzie opened the notebook, turned several pages, then began to read, not loudly, but in the voice of a man reading something he'd already gone over countless times in his own mind. He said that 14 months ago, a man named Hollis Weatherby had come there in a car belonging to a restaurant chain, had stood right outside the bakery, and had asked for Marin Kovalchik. Marin said she'd never heard that name before. Ozzie said exactly, because the man had never made it across the threshold. Beatrix had stopped him on the sidewalk, spoken with him for about 3 minutes, and he'd returned to his car and driven away. Maren asked what her stepmother had told him. Ozzy said she'd told him Maren had moved to Philadelphia in the spring. Maren said she'd never set foot in Philadelphia in her life. Ozzy said he knew. He said that for the past 14 months, he'd kept the date Maren supposedly went to Philadelphia exactly where it was in his notebook, and beside it he'd written one word, and that word was no. Maren asked who else had come. Ozzy turned 2 more pages. He said that 2 years earlier, a woman named Noelle Ashbury, a doctor, had come twice. The first time had been in March, the second in June. Both times she'd failed to see anyone, and both times she'd left behind a letter, placing it directly into Ozzy's hands outside the bakery and asking him to deliver it to Maren Kowalczyk. Maren asked if he'd delivered them. Ozzy said he had. He said he'd delivered both letters, by hand, all the way inside the bakery. Maren asked who he'd given them to. Ozzy fell silent. She asked again, and this time she heard something different in her own voice. Ozzy said he'd handed them to the person who came out to receive them, and both times that person had signed his notebook. Then he turned the notebook around, pushed it toward her, and pointed to 2 signatures written 3 months apart. Both were the same signature. It was Danika's. Maren stared at them for a long time. She said she'd never received a single letter. Ozzy said he knew. She asked whether he'd ever questioned it afterward. Ozzy said he had. The second time, he'd asked Danika the very next day, and Danika had said she'd already delivered it, placed it directly into Maren's hands, and she'd smiled when she said it. Maren asked if he'd believed her. Ozzy said he hadn't, but disbelief didn't give a man much power when all he had was a notebook. Then he added that the third person was the lawyer from Friday, Cormac Delaney. He'd written Delaney's name down that same afternoon, along with the exact time he'd entered and the exact time he'd left. 11 minutes on the dot. Maren sat down on the step beside him and asked the question she'd been wanting to ask for some time. She asked why, for 2 years, he hadn't told her any of this. Ozzy didn't answer immediately. He picked up his coffee cup, realized the coffee had gone cold, and set it back down. Then he said that 9 years earlier, he'd lost his home and his papers with it, and the person who had signed as guarantor for the place where he lived now had been Beatrix Kowalczyk. He said she held his signature, and he held the notebook, and for the past 2 years the two of them had been waiting to see which one would eventually weigh more. Maren said that meant he was afraid. Ozzy said he was 66 years old. It was October outside, and everyone his age was afraid of the same thing. But then he added that fear was fear, and writing things down was still writing things down, and a notebook filled faithfully for 2 years would eventually weigh more than a single signature. Maren asked when. Ozzy said when someone was brave enough to open it in front of a room full of people. She said she didn't have anyone. Ozzy said she had more people than she thought. Then he asked what she intended to do. Maren said she was going inside and asking Danika directly. Ozzy shook his head. He said if she went inside and confronted her directly, then within an hour this notebook would disappear. Whatever metal box she was thinking about would disappear too, and Maren would lose even the right to know. Maren asked what she was supposed to do then. Ozzy said she had to move like water. She asked what moving like water meant. He said water was soft on the outside and patient underneath. Water didn't strike a wall. It simply searched for a crack and waited. And in the end, every wall had a crack somewhere. Maren said she'd already been waiting for 8 years. Ozzy said then she'd already learned half the lesson. She asked what the other half was. He closed the notebook, slipped it back into his coat pocket, patted that pocket twice, and said the other half was knowing exactly when it was time to stop waiting. Maren didn't go in and confront anyone directly. She waited another 4 days. And during those 4 days, she did exactly what she'd always done. She got up at 3 o'clock, turned on the oven, wedged the rag into the corner of the oven door, baked, cleaned, kept her eyes lowered, and said nothing beyond what was necessary. By Thursday, Beatrix and Danika went to pick up supplies from the flour warehouse on Fort Street, and Maren knew that trip always took at least an hour and a half. She went upstairs. Danika's room was at the end of the hallway, and the door wasn't locked, because no one in that house had ever imagined Maren would dare open it. She stood in the middle of the room for about 10 seconds, and she didn't search the closet or open the drawers. She simply breathed in. The smell was faint, so faint that anyone who hadn't spent 8 years standing beside an oven would have missed it. But Maren recognized it immediately, because she knew exactly how burned paper smelled different from burned flour. She knelt down, looked beneath the bed, and saw it. A square metal tin, the kind used for holiday cookies, with nearly all the paint worn away from the lid. She pulled it out. She opened it. There were no cookies inside. There were ashes, paper ashes, fine and gray, mixed with a few pieces that hadn't burned completely, and one fragment still held the crease of a folded letter. Maren picked it up. 3 characters could still be read on the scrap, and the first was a capital M. She sank down onto the floor with the tin in her lap and remained there for a very long time. So long that when she finally heard the car returning in the alley, she didn't even startle. She closed the lid, pushed the tin back into exactly the place where she'd found it, lining it up with the square outline in the dust on the floor, then went downstairs to the kitchen and continued dividing the dough. Danica went upstairs to put away the supplies. Half an hour later, she came back down, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a while before asking Maren whether she'd been in her room. Maren said she had. Danica asked what she'd gone in there for. Maren said she'd gone to return a towel. Danica asked which towel. Maren said the blue one they'd washed on Tuesday. Danica said she didn't own a blue towel. Maren said then she must have gone into the wrong room. Danica stood there a little longer, then told her not to go up there again. Maren said, "All right." Then she added one more sentence, completely casually, in the voice of someone talking about the weather. She said, "I can smell ash." Danica didn't answer. Maren kept dividing the dough without turning around, and she said that the smell of burned paper clung to curtains longer than people realized, especially when the paper was thick. She said writing paper was thicker than newspaper. Danica said she didn't understand what Maren was talking about. Maren said she didn't understand either. She'd only smelled it. Danica took one step into the kitchen, then stopped. Maren heard the rhythm of her breathing change. Then Danica said Maren didn't know anything. Maren said that was true. She didn't know anything, and that was exactly what had been going on for the past 2 years. Danica asked what that was supposed to mean. Maren said it meant exactly what it sounded like. Danica picked up the wooden spoon from the table, then set it back down, and her hand trembled when she did it, and both of them saw. Then she said something she clearly hadn't meant to say, something that escaped as if it had been waiting behind her teeth for years. She said, "Nothing in this house has ever had my name on it." The kitchen went silent. Maren stopped working. She turned around, and for the first time in 8 years, she looked at Danica not as someone who was always telling on her, but as someone who had just dropped something on the floor. Quietly, she asked, "What did you say?" Danica said it was nothing. Maren said, "You just said nothing has ever had your name on it." Danica said she'd heard wrong. Maren said she hadn't heard wrong. She was standing less than 5 feet away. Danica said, "Then forget it." Maren asked whether someone had taken something from her. Danica said no. Maren asked again, very softly, almost as though it wasn't really a question. Danica said no, and her voice broke on the final word. Then she turned and went straight upstairs, her footsteps on the staircase faster than usual. Maren remained alone in the kitchen with both hands still buried in flour. She could have run after her. She could have gone downstairs and confronted Beatrix. She could have dragged the metal tin down, placed it in the middle of the dinner table that evening, and forced the entire family to look inside. She did none of those things. She thought about what Ozzy had told her, that if she struck the wall, everything would disappear within an hour, and she repeated 2 words silently to herself, like water. From that day forward, Maren didn't ask another question, but she began to watch. She watched what time Beatrix opened the safe and which pocket she slipped the key into. She watched Danica whenever the bell over the front door rang and noticed whether she looked toward the front of the bakery or glanced upstairs. She watched Piotr, and she counted that in a single day he turned the pages of his newspaper 17 times, and out of those 17 times, there were 3 when he wasn't reading at all. She watched the metal cabinet in the storage room every night, and she noticed that the lock wasn't broken, had never been broken, and no repairman ever came, even though Monday had long since passed. For 8 years, she'd become very good at keeping her head bowed. Now she was learning something else. She was learning how to keep her head bowed and still see everything. The 4th person came on a Tuesday afternoon, without an appointment and without a car. She walked down from the top of the street and pushed open the bakery door when there were only 2 customers left inside. She was about 36 years old, wearing a gray coat, carrying nothing in either hand, and the fact that she was carrying nothing was the first thing that made Beatrix wary. Beatrix invited her to sit down. The woman said she wasn't going to sit. Beatrix said the chair was clean. She said she didn't doubt the chair. She simply wasn't planning to stay long. Beatrix asked who she was. She said her name was Theodora Vance. Beatrix asked what she wanted. Vance said she needed to speak with Marin Kowalczyk. Beatrix smiled and said an awful lot of people seemed to be looking for the girl lately. Vance asked, how many was an awful lot? Beatrix said it was just an expression. Vance said she didn't work with expressions. She worked with numbers. Beatrix said the girl wasn't home. Vance asked whether she wasn't home or simply wasn't allowed to come out. Beatrix said that was the kind of question an outsider asked. Vance said she was indeed an outsider, and outsiders were always the ones who asked the questions people inside were too afraid to ask. Beatrix said it didn't matter anyway because it was too late. The girl was already engaged. Vance asked who she was engaged to. Beatrix said to a family in Boston. Vance asked which family in Boston. Beatrix said that was a private matter between the two families. Vance asked what you called two families when neither one seemed to know the other's name. Beatrix said she was insolent. Vance said she was only counting. She went on to say that an engaged woman usually had a ring, a date, someone from the groom's family calling to ask after her. And during the past 4 months, not a single person from Boston had walked through that door. Beatrix asked how she knew. Vance said she knew because that was her job. From the front counter, Danica cut in and said her sister really was getting married. Vance turned toward her and asked what day. Danica was silent. Vance asked what month. Danica said she couldn't remember. Vance said if a younger sister couldn't remember the month of her own sister's wedding, then that was a month that had never existed. Beatrix told Danica to go into the back. Danica went. In the kitchen, Marin stood pressed close to the dividing wall, both hands still covered in flour, and she heard every single word. Vance said she needed only one very small thing, something anyone could give her, and that was to see Marin Kowalczyk for 30 seconds. Beatrix said no. Vance asked why not. Beatrix said because this was her house. Vance said this was a bakery. The door was open. The business hours were posted outside, and anyone was allowed to walk in. Beatrix said if people came in, they came in to buy bread. Vance said then she'd buy some, and she placed money on the counter and said she'd buy 1 loaf, but she wanted the person who baked it to bring it out. Beatrix said the baker was busy. Vance said if she was busy, she'd wait. Beatrix said she would close early. Vance said closing early on a Tuesday afternoon was an answer, not a business decision. Then she turned, and for the first time since she'd entered, she looked directly at Piotr. He was sitting in his usual chair, the newspaper resting on his lap, folded closed for some time now. Vance walked over and stopped 2 paces away from him, and she said she wouldn't ask him much. She would ask only one question, and she needed only one word. She asked whether his daughter was engaged, yes or no. The room went silent. Beatrix opened her mouth, and Vance raised one hand. Not rudely, she simply raised it, and said she hadn't asked her. Piotr looked down at the newspaper. Vance said he didn't need to explain, didn't need to tell a story, didn't need to protect anyone. He needed only one word, and no one lost anything by giving one word. Piotr said nothing. Vance waited. She waited longer than people usually waited, long enough that Beatrix had to clear her throat, and still Vance waited. In the kitchen, Marin pressed her forehead against the dividing wall and closed her eyes, and she prayed that he would say anything at all, even the word yes, even a lie, as long as it came in his voice. Piotr opened the newspaper. He turned 1 page. Vance nodded very slowly. She thanked him, and she meant it sincerely, without sarcasm, and somehow that was harder to bear than sarcasm would have been. Then she walked toward the door. Beatrix called after her and asked what she did with the things she heard. Vance stopped at the threshold. She said she didn't judge anyone. Beatrix asked what she did. Then, Vance said she reported. Beatrix asked who she reported to. Vance said to the person who was counting her door. Beatrix asked who was counting the door of her house. Vance said that person had been counting for 4 months, and Beatrix was only beginning to notice today. Then she stepped outside and closed the door very gently behind her, and the bell above it rang exactly once. Beatrix stood watching after her. She didn't say anything for 1 full minute. Then she turned to Piotr and told him to go to bed. Piotr folded the newspaper, stood up, and walked past the kitchen doorway where Marin was standing, and he knew she was there because the kitchen light was still on. He didn't look inside. That night, Marin baked the batch of dark bread alone. She thought about the words, "Someone is counting the door of your house." And she thought about Mr. Halloran saying that someone had been paying for the parking space at the end of the street since June, and for the first time, those two things touched each other inside her mind. She didn't know whether she should be afraid or relieved. She only knew that out there, at the end of the street, a man had been sitting in the same place for exactly 4 months. The bakery telephone rang at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, and Piotr was the one who answered it. He listened for about 40 seconds, said yes 3 times, then set the receiver down and sat perfectly still. Beatrix asked who had called. He said the bank. She asked what they'd said. He said they'd used a word they'd never used before, and that word was foreclosure. Beatrix stood up and closed the door leading to the front counter. That night, after the bakery closed, the 3 of them remained seated in the back kitchen, and Maren was told to go upstairs. She reached the 8th step, then stopped, sat down in the darkness, and listened. Beatrix said the situation was simpler than he thought. What was going to kill this house wasn't the loan. It was all the people who kept coming to knock on the door. Piotr asked what one thing had to do with the other. Beatrix said they were connected because every time a stranger stood outside the bakery asking for the girl, the entire neighborhood turned its eyes toward this house, and a house in debt couldn't survive being watched. Piotr said the girl hadn't done anything. Beatrix said exactly. She hadn't done anything, and that was the problem. Piotr said she got up at 3 o'clock every morning. Beatrix said she knew. Piotr said she baked everything they sold each day. Beatrix said she knew. Piotr said then enough. Leave her alone. And he said it louder than anything he'd said in 8 years. And Beatrix was silent for exactly 3 seconds before she said one thing. She asked, "Do you want me to open the drawer, Piotr?" On the staircase, Maren clearly heard the faint scrape of her father's chair shifting. Then there was no sound from him at all. Beatrix continued, her voice calm again as though nothing had happened. She said she'd been thinking for 2 weeks and she'd found a way. She said people kept coming to ask about the girl because the girl was still there to be asked about, because she was still the unmarried daughter of a family that owned a shop on the corner. She said if they wanted people to stop asking questions, hiding her wasn't the answer, because hiding someone only made people search harder. What they had to do was push her down 1 level, to a place where no one would bother coming for her anymore. Piotr asked what level. Beatrix said the level of a married woman. Piotr asked married to whom. Beatrix said it didn't matter who, as long as the name made everyone else stop asking questions. Danica, sitting at the corner of the table, said then they'd have to find someone truly terrible, because if Maren married a normal man, people would still ask about her. Beatrix said exactly. Danica laughed and said then they might as well marry her off to the man in the wheelchair at the end of the street, because no one would ever care enough to ask about him. She meant it as a joke. After she said it, she laughed once more. Beatrix didn't laugh. She set down her teacup and remained silent for a very long time, long enough that Danica stopped laughing. Then Beatrix said, "That joke of yours has just grown legs." Danica asked if her mother was joking. Beatrix said she never joked after 9 o'clock at night. Piotr said no. Beatrix asked, "Why not?" Piotr said because she was his daughter. Beatrix said he hadn't called her by name once in 8 years, and now he suddenly remembered she was his daughter. Piotr didn't answer. Beatrix continued, speaking very slowly, saying that the man had no one, no home, no papers, not a single relative who would ever come demanding anything, and a man like that would never cause trouble for anyone. She added that the girl would be out of this house, out of this kitchen, out of this doorway, and from that point forward, anyone who wanted to ask questions could go ask them somewhere else. Danica said the entire neighborhood would talk about it all winter. Beatrix said, "Let them talk," because when people were talking about a wedding, they stopped talking about a debt. Danica went quiet. Then she asked how her mother planned to tell her sister. Beatrix said she wouldn't tell her anything. They'd simply wait until the day came. Piotr said they had to ask her. Beatrix said what for, because if they asked her, she'd start talking again. And every time she talked, there was another problem in this house. Piotr asked, "What about the documents?" Beatrix said she kept all of them. The birth certificate, the identification card. Everything was inside the metal cabinet in the storage room, and she would file the application herself. On the staircase, Maren sat completely motionless in the dark as she heard the words, "metal cabinet" in the storage room. She thought of the metal box with the strip of yellowed paper tape, of the handwriting that leaned slightly to the left, with the long tail on the letter K. Down below, Beatrix told her husband that all he had to do was sign in one place, just one place, and he'd be able to sleep starting tomorrow night. Piotr asked what he was supposed to sign. Beatrix said something that would finally let the girl have some peace. Piotr said she was lying. Beatrix said she wasn't lying. She was simply choosing her words. Then she stood up, washed her cup, and before turning off the kitchen light, she added one more sentence, speaking to her husband's back, saying that the drawer was still exactly where it had always been, that in 8 years she'd never opened it once, and that she hoped she would never have to. The light went out. Maren pulled her feet up and remained sitting in the darkness of the staircase for another 10 minutes. Then she went downstairs, crossed the kitchen, stepped through the back door, and stood outside looking toward the end of the street, where a motionless figure sat beneath the streetlight. She didn't know who he was. She only knew that someone inside this house had just decided her fate, and that person wasn't her. On Monday afternoon, Beatrix put on a proper coat and walked down to the end of the street, with Danica following one step behind, carrying a blue document folder in her hand. The man was sitting in his usual place beside the red brick wall. He saw the two of them approaching from a distance, and showed no surprise at all, and that was the first thing Beatrix noticed without saying aloud. She greeted him. He greeted her back. She asked whether he knew who she was. He said she was the woman who opened the bakery at 6 o'clock in the morning and closed it at 7 o'clock in the evening, except on Sundays. Beatrix said he paid close attention. He said when a man sat all day, he had to do something. She said she'd come to discuss a matter. He told her to go ahead. Beatrix said there was a daughter in her household who had reached marriageable age, and the family wanted to see her settled. He asked what settled meant. Beatrix said it meant having a husband. He asked who the husband was. Beatrix said, "You." The man said nothing for about 5 seconds. Then he asked why him. Beatrix said because he was nearby. He said everyone in the neighborhood was nearby. Beatrix said because he had no one. He said that answer was more truthful than the first one. Danica stood beside her mother, shifting half a step backward, and looked down at the 2 wheels of the wheelchair, at the frame, at the handles, then looked away. Beatrix said her family wasn't the kind of family that threw a daughter into the street empty-handed, and she told Danica to hand her the folder. She opened it, took out a sheet of paper, and placed it on his lap. She said it was an agreement relinquishing family rights, a perfectly ordinary document, and once the girl signed it, both sides would be even, with no one owing anyone anything afterward. Then she placed an envelope on top of the paper. She said there were $500 inside. He asked what the $500 were for. Beatrix said for the signature. He asked what the signature was supposed to give up. Beatrix said things that didn't exist. He asked if they didn't exist, why did anyone need a signature giving them up? Beatrix said it was simply to keep things tidy. He said people only tidied drawers that had something inside them. Beatrix said he had a strange way of talking. He didn't answer. He picked up the paper and read it. He read very slowly, one line at a time, and he took so long that Danica began shifting her weight from one foot to the other. He read it a second time. Then he turned it over, saw that the back was blank, and turned it face up again. He didn't make a single comment about what the document said. He only asked who had drafted it. Beatrix said an acquaintance. He asked whether that acquaintance had a law degree. Beatrix said he asked too many questions for a man sitting on a sidewalk. He said sitting on a sidewalk was exactly why he had to ask questions, because he had nothing to lose except the answer. Then he lowered the paper onto his lap and said he agreed. Beatrix lifted her chin slightly, because she'd prepared herself for bargaining and hadn't been given any. She said then it was settled. He said it wasn't settled yet. She asked what else there was. He said he had one condition. Beatrix asked what condition. Money. He said it wasn't money. She asked what it was. Then, he said he wanted to hear the woman herself answer. Beatrix said her voice wasn't part of the terms. He said it was his only term. Beatrix said the girl would do whatever the family decided. He said he wasn't asking the family. Beatrix said he was negotiating with her. He said he was negotiating with her about everything except the one thing that mattered most. Beatrix said this arrangement didn't require that. He said it might not require it for her, but it did for him. She asked why. He was quiet for a moment, then said that too many people in his life had made decisions for him when he hadn't been able to speak, and he had no intention of doing the same thing to someone else. Beatrix said that sounded like something from a book. He said he didn't have books, he only had time. Danica cut in and said her sister would agree anyway, because her sister agreed to everything. He turned toward Danica and asked why, then. Was it so difficult for them to let him hear one word from her? Danica didn't answer. Beatrix said she didn't have time to stand in the street arguing. He said then bring her out here, 30 seconds, and afterward he'd sign anything Beatrix wanted. Beatrix said she would think about it. He said there was nothing to think about, because if she didn't bring the woman out, he wouldn't sign. And if he didn't sign, Beatrix would have to find someone else, and finding someone else would take time, and she clearly didn't have much time. Beatrix stared at him for a very long time. Then she said all right. She added that the application had already been filed the previous week. The date had already been set, the following Saturday, and everything had already been arranged. He asked whether filed the previous week meant she'd submitted the paperwork before she'd even come to speak with him. Beatrix said she believed in being prepared. He said she'd prepared so thoroughly that she'd filled in the groom's name before knowing whether the groom agreed. Beatrix didn't answer that. She picked up the envelope, placed it back inside the folder, said the money would be handed over afterward, then turned away. After 3 steps, she stopped and asked his name so she could write it correctly. He said she'd already filled it in, hadn't she? Beatrix said she'd used the name from the municipal records. He said then the municipal records knew before she did. She walked away. Danica followed, and when they reached the top of the street, she turned her head once and looked back, and she saw that the man was still sitting there, still holding the paper on his lap, and he was reading it for the 3rd time. The next morning, Beatrix called Maren out to the front kitchen and told her plainly that she was getting married the following Saturday. Maren set down the dough scraper. She asked who she was marrying. Beatrix, said the man at the end of the street. Maren asked who had decided. Beatrix said the family. Maren asked who exactly the family included. Beatrix said she was asking too many questions for someone about to receive a blessing. Maren asked whether her father knew. Piotr, standing in the kitchen doorway, said it had already been decided. Maren looked at him and asked in which room it had been decided, and by whose mouth. He said by a signature. She said a signature wasn't the same thing as a goodbye. Beatrix said enough. This afternoon she was going down there because the man wanted to see her. Maren asked what for. Beatrix said she didn't know. He'd demanded it. Maren asked what he'd demanded. Beatrix said he'd demanded to hear her speak, and in 8 years, that was the sentence that kept Maren silent longer than any other. That afternoon, all 4 of them went down to the end of the street. The man was still sitting in his usual place. Beatrix said, "There, the girl is here. Ask whatever you need and let's be done with it." He didn't ask anything right away. He looked at Maren, and the first thing he said wasn't a question. He said, "My name is August." Maren said she knew his face, but she hadn't known his name. He said now she knew both. Then he asked whether she knew why everyone was standing there. She said yes. He asked who had told her. She said her stepmother. That morning, in the kitchen, while she was dividing dough, he asked what she'd known before that morning. She said nothing. He asked whether anyone had asked what she wanted. She said no. He asked whether she meant no one had asked her in this matter, or no one had ever asked her in her life. Maren didn't answer immediately. Beatrix said he was asking too many questions and told Maren to just say yes, so they could finish. August said he hadn't asked her. Beatrix fell silent. He turned back to Maren and asked again, and this time he spoke more slowly. He asked whether she wanted to marry him, yes or no, and told her to answer truthfully, and if she said no, he would tell her family himself that he refused, and no one would blame her. Maren stood there for a very long time. She looked down at her hands, at the crack across her right palm that split open every winter, and she thought about the wall separating the kitchen from the front counter, about the back alley that was 20 paces long, about the sound of 7 keys clicking together inside an apron pocket, about the night she'd stood outside the back door and watched her father open his mouth only to close it again. Then she said no one had ever asked her anything. She said that for 8 years no one had asked what she wanted to eat, where she wanted to go, or who she wanted to know her name, and now the first person ever to ask her a question was the man everyone in the neighborhood walked past every day without bothering to ask his name. She said, "Then I'll come." Beatrix said then it was settled. Maren said it wasn't settled. She turned toward her stepmother and said she was going not because Beatrix had told her to go. Beatrix asked why, then. Maren said because she wanted to get out of that house. She said she'd spent 8 years inside that kitchen, and she knew perfectly well that if she stayed another 8 years, She'd still be the night shift girl, and she'd rather walk out with nothing in her hands than remain there as a name no one ever called. Beatrix said she would regret it. Maren said maybe she would, but it would be the first time she'd ever regretted something she'd chosen for herself. August listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said all right, and added that he couldn't promise her much. He could promise only one thing, that in his house, no one would eat after she did. Beatrix gave a scornful laugh and asked what house. August said any house would do, as long as it had a door. When they returned to the bakery, Beatrix told Danica to go into the storage room and get the documents. She handed her the key and told her to take exactly 2 things: Maren's birth certificate and identification card, both kept in the 3rd box. Danica went in. She opened the cabinet. She pulled out the 3rd box, bearing her mother's familiar handwriting, H. Kowalski K., and found the sealed ivory envelope hidden beneath the identity cards. Danica recognized the handwriting immediately. She'd seen it throughout her childhood, on little notes stuck to the refrigerator, on the lids of spice jars, on the side of the oven. She crouched in the dark storage room and lifted the envelope, and her hand trembled slightly as she read the words written across it for a very long time. From outside, Beatrix called in and asked whether she'd found them yet. Danica said she had. She placed the envelope back exactly where it had been, put the identification card on top of it, placed the birth certificate above that, closed the lid of the box, slid it back into the cabinet, shut the door, and turned the key. She came out carrying the 2 documents in her hands and said nothing. Beatrix asked whether there was anything else inside. Danica said there was nothing. What none of them realized was that Beatrix had kept that ivory envelope sealed for 8 long years, assuming it held nothing more than forgotten personal letters. In her rush to rid herself of Maren through a forced marriage, she never suspected that she was setting off the exact trigger her dead mother had hidden away, the very clause that would strip her of the bakery, the moment Maren became a married woman. Beatrix didn't hold the wedding in a church, and she didn't hold it inside the house. She held it right there on the sidewalk in front of the bakery, and she told the neighbors it was because the house was too cramped, though everyone in Locust Point understood that wasn't the real reason. She set 2 plastic chairs near the curb, fastened a strip of ribbon across the doorway, and told Danica to post on the bakery's page that everyone was welcome to come celebrate at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. By then, about 30 people were standing around the outside, some holding cups of coffee, some stopping on their way back from the market, and all of them keeping just enough distance to see everything clearly without having to become part of it. Maren stepped out of the bakery with an old shawl around her shoulders. It was her mother's gray wool shawl, the only thing that had survived 8 years, the thing Beatrix had thrown into the rag bin twice, and Maren had taken back both times. The ends were worn thin. She wasn't wearing a wedding dress. She wore the dark blue sweater she usually wore to work, freshly washed, and she'd ironed it the night before. Beatrix looked at her and said humility suited a bride better than lace. Maren said then humility had been personally invited today. At the edge of the sidewalk, August was waiting. He wore a dark coat buttoned all the way up, and he'd shaved. No one from his side came, because there was no side of his family to come. The pastor from the church at the top of the street asked whether either side had someone willing to serve as a witness, and Ozzie Brennan crossed over from the other side of the street, took his place beside the groom, and said he would witness. Beatrix looked at him but said nothing. Danica raised her phone and began recording from the start. She stood at the corner where the light fell best, and she'd chosen that angle in advance. The pastor asked the bride whether she entered into this willingly. Maren said she was entering with her eyes open. He asked whether that meant yes. Maren said it was the truest answer she could give that morning. He asked the groom whether he promised to care for this woman. August said he would treat her better than people had treated her before. The pastor said that wasn't written in the book. August said he knew. A few quiet laughs moved through the crowd. Someone said just loudly enough that the beggar had managed to marry a beautiful woman. Someone else answered that the beautiful woman had married right there on the sidewalk. Ozzie turned toward the voices, and the voices stopped. The pastor declared before God and before this street that the 2 of them were husband and wife. Danica lowered her phone and checked the recording, and that was when she saw it. Not August's face. She saw the wheelchair. She'd worked the front of the bakery for 6 years, placed orders, compared prices, and could look at a display case and tell what it cost, and her eyes stopped on the frame. It wasn't painted aluminum. It was woven carbon fiber, the diagonal pattern clearly visible where the sunlight struck it. The 2 wheels angled inward at a custom setting. The axles used sealed bearings, and the armrests weren't plastic but hand-stitched leather that had already developed a rich patina. She looked for another 10 seconds. Then she walked to her mother and whispered into her ear, telling her to look at that chair. Beatrix asked what was wrong with it. Danica said that wasn't a hospital wheelchair. Beatrix asked what difference that made. Danica said it was custom-made. Definitely custom-made. And the frame alone probably cost more than the car her mother drove. Beatrix said someone had given it to him. Danica said no one gave a beggar something like that. People gave blankets, shoes, food. No one gave away a carbon fiber frame. Beatrix said then he'd found it. Danica asked whether her mother had heard what she'd just said. Beatrix turned toward her daughter and said today was a happy day. And she said the word happy, in a voice both of them understood. Then she added that everyone who sat in a wheelchair looked the same anyway. Danica said beggars didn't sit in chairs worth more than their cars. Beatrix said she was looking too closely. Danica said her mother had taught her to look. Beatrix turned and went inside. Danica remained there for a while longer, still holding the phone, but she wasn't recording anymore. Marin was taken to the edge of the road. She turned and looked back at the bakery once. Piotr hadn't come outside. He was sitting inside behind the glass, in his usual chair, and from where she stood, all she could see was the shadow of a man and a newspaper. Marin looked directly at that place for about 3 seconds, then turned away. Ozzy walked with the two of them as far as the top of the street. He told the little mistress to go well. Marin told him to keep the notebook safe. Ozzy said he'd kept it for 9 years, so keeping it a few more months wouldn't hurt. Then he leaned down and whispered 2 words into her ear, like water. Marin nodded. The two of them walked away. No one carried her cloth bag for her, because everything she owned fit inside it, and it was light. After they'd gone half a block, August asked if she was tired. Marin said she'd spent 8 years standing, so walking today was nothing. He said then, from today onward, they would walk as 2. She said walking as 2 felt strange. He said if it was strange, they'd learn. Behind them, in front of the bakery, the crowd had already scattered. The ribbon was still hanging across the doorway, and Danica stood alone on the sidewalk, replaying the video, dragging it back to the exact moment the wheelchair entered the frame, then stopping there and staring for a very long time. The room was on the 2nd floor of a row building 4 blocks from the bakery, with one window facing the wall of the building next door, a 2-burner electric stove, a small wooden table, and exactly 1 chair. Marin stood in the middle of the room, looked around, and asked where the other chair was. August said there was only 1. She asked where he was supposed to sit. Then, he lightly patted the armrest of his wheelchair and said he carried his chair with him. She laughed, and the sound surprised her because it was the first time she'd laughed in 3 weeks. She asked how much the room cost to rent. He said it had already been paid for. She asked what he'd paid with. He said with an old debt someone else owed. She asked who owed him. He said everyone owed someone, something, somewhere. On the stove sat a pot of rice and a container of ready-made stew. He served 2 bowls, pushed the fuller one toward her, and waited. Marin picked up her spoon, then set it back down and told him to eat first. He said no. She asked why. He said because on the sidewalk he'd promised in front of 30 people that in his house no one would eat after her, and he kept the things he said. She said men said things and then forgot them. He said then she should watch and count. She ate. He waited until she'd finished half her bowl before he picked up his spoon. When they were done, she asked his full name. He said August. She asked August what. He said the last name came later in the story. She said he was going in circles again. He said no. He was putting things in order. She asked what he'd done before he started sitting at the end of the street. He said he'd hauled freight. She asked what kind. He said the heavy kind. She asked what had happened to his legs. He was silent for a while, then said there had been one night when he'd been left in the middle of the road, and when he woke up, his legs no longer listened to him. She asked who had left him there. He said people he'd once trusted. She asked where they were now. He said that part came later too. She said his whole life seemed to come later. He said every story was like that. People simply liked demanding the last page first. She asked why he'd sat at the end of the street for 4 months. He said because from there he could see the bakery's back door. She asked why he needed to watch it. He said to know whether anyone still walked out through it. Marin didn't ask anything else. She washed the 2 bowls, and while she was washing them, She realized she was working without anyone standing behind her counting the time. And the feeling was so strange that she had to stop moving for a moment. At about 9 o'clock that night, there was a knock at the door. Maren opened it. Danica stood in the hallway with nothing in her hands, her hair loose, and the expression on her face belonged to someone who had spent a long time standing downstairs before finding the nerve to come up. Maren told her to come in. Danica didn't. She remained at the threshold and looked inside. At the wooden table, the 2-burner stove, the single chair beside the table, and she looked at the chair longest of all. She asked where Maren sat. Maren said that chair was hers. Danica asked where he sat. Then, Maren said he carried his chair with him. Danica didn't laugh. From inside, August invited her in. Danica said she wouldn't stay long. Then she turned to Maren and asked a question very quickly. She asked whether their mother had said anything to Maren the night before. Maren said no. Danica asked about the days before that. Maren said her stepmother only said 3 things to her each day, and all 3 were orders. Danica went quiet. Then she said that on Thursday night she'd walked past her mother's room, and the door had been slightly open, and her mother was on the telephone. Maren asked who she'd been calling. Danica said she didn't know. It was a man's voice, and her mother addressed him formally. Maren asked what they'd said. Danica said she'd only heard the end of the conversation. Maren asked what the end was. Danica didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the hallway floor and said their mother had mentioned Maren's name. Maren asked how she'd mentioned it. Danica said she'd spoken Maren's name the way people spoke about something they meant to trade. Maren asked what she was trading it for. Danica said she hadn't heard that part. Maren asked if she was sure. Danica said she wasn't sure of anything. She was only sure of one thing, that her mother had said Maren's name twice, and both times it hadn't sounded like a mother talking about her child. From inside the room, August asked her only one question. He asked whether the man had mentioned the bakery. Danica said no. He asked whether he'd mentioned her father. Danica said no. He asked if he'd only mentioned Maren. Then, Danica said yes, only her. August sat still. He didn't ask anything else. Maren asked why she'd come down there, because she hated her. Danica said she hadn't come there to talk about that. Maren asked what she'd come for then. Danica stepped back once and said she didn't know, maybe so that later she wouldn't have to keep thinking about it. Then she turned away. After 3 steps, she stopped without looking back and said to the hallway in front of her that Maren shouldn't believe their mother wanted her settled and safe. Maren asked what their mother wanted. Then, Danica said she didn't know. Maren asked whether she intended to find out. Danica said she'd tried to find out once before, when she was 19, and that time she'd lost something she could never get back. Maren asked what she'd lost. Danica didn't answer. She walked down the stairs, and the sound of her footsteps grew fainter until the door downstairs closed. Maren stood in the doorway for a very long time. Behind her, August said she should come inside because it was cold out there. She came in, closed the door, and asked what he thought. He said he thought they should lock the door tonight. She asked if he was afraid. He said he wasn't afraid. He was only counting. Maren woke a little before 1 o'clock in the morning because of a sound that didn't belong there. It wasn't noise. It was the steady hum of a car engine running out on the street, running without stopping, never shutting off. And in a neighborhood where everyone turned off the ignition before opening a car door, an engine left running for 15 straight minutes was a statement, not a vehicle. She sat up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside just enough to make a narrow slit. The car was parked at an angle across the street. Every light turned off, the windows dark, and exhaust rose steadily from the tailpipe into the cold air. The sleeping mat in the corner of the room was empty. August wasn't there. She heard voices in the hallway. She went to the door and stood behind it, listening. His voice didn't sound like any voice she'd heard from him in the past 3 weeks. It was clipped. It was cold. It didn't ask. It ordered. He said, "Tell me who supplied the car." He listened. He said, "I didn't ask who was driving. I asked who supplied it." He listened again. Then he said, "Fine. Wake Rusiecki up. Tell him to get down to lot 3 right now. Don't wait for his shift." He went quiet for a moment, then continued, "Shut both west gates, starting tonight. Write down everyone who comes through. And if anyone refuses to be logged, don't let them in. And tell the men at gate 6, this order comes from me, not dispatch." He listened. Then he said each word with deliberate clarity. "The Kowalczyk file stays exactly as it is. Nobody touches that file. and anyone who lays a hand on it before I say so doesn't need to report for work tomorrow night, and repeat that to all 3 crews, exactly as I said it. On the other end of the line, Marin faintly heard a man's voice answer, and the man didn't call August by his name. He called him boss. Marin stood frozen behind the door. She'd heard her last name. She'd heard the word file. She'd heard a man in a wheelchair give 3 orders in 40 seconds, and nobody had questioned a single one of them. Outside, 2 car doors opened. Marin looked through the slit in the curtain and saw 2 men get out, both wearing dark coats, neither of them closing the car doors behind them, while the engine kept running. They crossed the street. August ended the call. He didn't turn back toward the room. He wheeled himself to the head of the staircase and stopped there, exactly where the hallway light fell across his face. Marin cracked the door open. She looked down. The 2 men reached the first-floor landing and stopped when they saw him. The man in front asked if he was the one renting room 21. August said yes. The man said they were looking for a woman named Kowalczyk. August asked who had sent them. The man said someone had asked them to come. August asked whether they'd been asked or hired. The man didn't answer. August asked again, in the same voice, "Who hired you?" The man behind him said this had nothing to do with August. And August said exactly one sentence. He said, "I'm August Reinhold. The West Gate is mine. Cold storage 6 and 7 are mine, and you just passed through 3 places staffed by my people to get here." The hallway went silent. The man in front didn't move for about 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, Marin watched his face change. Not with loud, obvious fear, but in the way a man's face changes when he realizes he's read the address wrong. He said, "Say your name again." August said, "I don't repeat myself." The man in back tugged at the other man's sleeve and whispered something into his ear, and Marin only caught the last 3 words, "The man at the port." The man in front said they'd been given an address. Only an address, no name. August said, "Now you have a name." The man said they would leave. August said, "Before you go, take a message back." The man asked what message. August said, "Tell whoever paid you that the woman in this room isn't part of any exchange, and if anyone stands beneath this window for one more night, I won't be having the next conversation in a hallway." The man gave one nod. Both of them turned and headed downstairs, and the man in back walked backward for the first 3 steps. The car doors slammed shut, the engine revved, and the car pulled away. Less than a minute later, another vehicle moved slowly past the end of the block in the same direction, headlights off, and didn't stop. Marin opened the room door all the way and stood there, and August turned his chair around and saw her. He didn't ask how much she'd heard. He knew. He wheeled himself into the room, and she closed the door behind him, then stood with her back against it because her legs weren't entirely steady. She asked who he was. He said he was August Reinhold. She asked what that name meant. He said it meant there were certain gates at the Port of Baltimore that only opened when he agreed, and about 400 people put food on their tables because of those gates. She asked what they called him. He said, "They call me boss." She asked how many men he had. He said enough. She asked what kind of man he was. He said he was the kind of man she'd need some time to put in the right place. She said a man like him had sat out on the street for 4 months. Doing what? He said watching. She asked watching what? He said watching to see whether anyone else came out the back door of that house, and what they came out for. She asked if he'd known she would bring bread outside. He said he hadn't known, he'd only waited. She asked who he'd been waiting for. He didn't answer. She said her family name had just come out of his mouth on the phone like it belonged to a case file. He said yes. She asked what was in that file. He said everything. She asked how long he'd had it. He said 2 years. She asked who the 2 men had been. He said hired men. She asked who'd hired them. He said the man who's trying to take my port, and the fastest way to take a man is to find the thing he cares about. She asked if that thing was her. He said 4 months, sitting outside where anyone could see was enough, and people didn't need to know why. They only needed to know there was something there. Marin sat down in the only chair in the room, and she sat there for a very long time, and at last she asked the question she feared most. She asked why he'd married her. August looked at her and said there was one thing he would tell her, all of it, without leaving out a single word, but not tonight. She asked what he was giving her tonight. Then, he said, "Tonight I'm giving you a door with a bolt on it, and 2 men downstairs until morning." And then he added that he would sit right there, facing that door. At 7 o'clock on Monday morning, 3 trucks pulled up in front of the Kowalczyk bakery, and 7 people wearing blue windbreakers stepped out, the man in front carrying a stack of papers clipped inside a stiff folder. Beatrix came out and opened the door and asked what was happening. The man said this was the procedure for repossessing secured assets. Beatrix said she didn't understand. He said she didn't need to understand. She only needed to sign where it confirmed that she'd received the notice. Piotr came out from inside without even having time to put on his shoes. He asked who had authorized this. The man said the court. Piotr asked which court. The man turned a page and read the case number, then stated that following the formal submission of a verified deed of ownership by their creditor's legal representative on October 17th, Piotr's loan was immediately found to be in violation of the Secured Property Ownership Clause. He explained that as of the 17th, official court records confirmed the property did not belong to the borrower, rendering it invalid as collateral, and automatically maturing the entire balance in full. Beatrix asked what day October 17th had been. Danica, standing behind her mother, said the 17th had been Saturday. Beatrix turned and looked at her daughter. Danica said that was the day Marin got married. All three of them stood motionless in the middle of the sidewalk. The repossession team began placing seals on the storage door, on the refrigerator, even on the oven. Piotr followed them and said that oven belonged to his wife. The man in charge said the oven was listed among the secured assets. Piotr said his wife had bought it with her own money. The man said then it belonged on the list even more clearly. The 3 delivery trucks parked in the back lot were hooked up and towed away, one by one, while the entire neighborhood watched from across the street. Beatrix said she hadn't received any notices. The man said there had been 3 notices, all sent by certified mail, and all 3 had been signed for. She asked who had signed. He pulled out 3 delivery receipts and turned them around for her to see. Beatrix looked. The 3 signatures were identical, written in the same hand, signed 2 months apart each time. All 3 were hers. Piotr stepped closer and looked, and for a long time he said nothing. Then he asked whether she'd signed 3 times without saying a single word to him. Beatrix said she signed dozens of things every month. Invoices, deliveries, school papers. He asked whether she'd opened them. Beatrix didn't answer. He asked again, louder this time, whether she'd opened them and read them. She said she couldn't remember. He said she remembered the price of flour every single month for 6 years. Beatrix said he hadn't told her he'd mortgaged the property either. He said, "I hid it because I was afraid." She said, "So was I." He said, "No, you weren't afraid. You calculated." The man in charge cleared his throat and handed them another sheet of paper, thinner than the others, printed on letterhead. He told them to look at the creditor's name on the 3rd line. Piotr took it. He read it. Then he read it again. Beatrix asked who it was. He didn't answer. She snatched the paper from his hand. On the 3rd line, printed in bold, was the name of the company listed as the creditor, Helena Cold Storage and Freight. Beatrix stared at those words for a very long time. Danica asked her mother what was wrong. Beatrix said nothing was wrong. Danica said her face had gone completely white. Beatrix said it was hot. Danica said it was 50 degrees outside. Piotr said, "This name." Beatrix said there were thousands of people in America with that name. Piotr said, "I know, but there aren't thousands of companies buying the debt of the one bakery that carries her name." Beatrix said the bank had the right to sell the debt to whoever it wanted. Piotr asked the man in charge when the bank had sold it. He said 11 months ago. Piotr asked why no one had foreclosed during those 11 months. The man said because the creditor hadn't requested it. Piotr asked why the creditor was requesting it now. The man said because there was now a breach condition, and no one had chosen it or decided it. It had happened automatically on the 17th. Beatrix said that was absurd. No one could transfer ownership of her property. The man said no one had transferred anything. It had already been written that way from the beginning and had only been waiting for one condition, and that condition had occurred on Saturday. Beatrix asked what condition. He said they should ask their attorney. Then he pulled out the final document and handed it to Piotr. Piotr asked what else there was. The man said it was a summons. Piotr asked where they were being summoned. He said 9 o'clock the next morning, at the creditor's office, for a recorded deposition in connection with a dispute over ownership rights. Piotr asked who had to attend. The man read 4 names: Piotr Kowalczyk, Beatrix Kowalczyk, Danica Kowalczyk, and Marin Kowalczyk. Beatrix said the girl had nothing to do with this family anymore. The man said then she could say that into the recorder tomorrow. All 3 trucks were towed away. The repossession team got back into their vehicles. Before closing the door, the man in charge turned back and said the creditor had left them a message. Piotr asked what message. The man said the creditor wanted them there at exactly 9 o'clock, and there was no need to bring anything because the other side already had everything. The vehicles drove away. On the bakery's glass door, the yellow seizure notice covered the exact place where the business hours sign had been posted. Danica stood staring at it and said softly, almost to herself, that the name on that paper was the name of the grandmother she'd never had, and Beatrix snapped at her to be quiet. At 9 o'clock that night, after the bakery had been sealed and the whole family was sitting in the back kitchen beneath a single light bulb, there was a knock at the door. Piotr went to open it. A woman stood outside, about 38 years old, wearing a long coat and carrying a thin briefcase. She said her name was Noelle Ashbury. Piotr said he didn't know her. She said she'd stood outside this very door twice before. From inside, Beatrix said it was late. Mrs. Ashbury said she would ask only one question and then leave. Piotr invited her in. Ozzie Brennan walked in behind her without being invited, pulled out a chair, and sat down at the corner of the table as though he'd been sitting there for years. Beatrix asked what he was doing there. Ozzie said he'd come to return something he'd been keeping for someone. Then he placed the hard-covered notebook on the table, pushed it into the middle, and didn't open it. He said all the dates were in there, and anyone who wanted to read them could read them. No one touched it. Mrs. Ashbury asked her question. She said that 2 years earlier she'd sent 2 letters to this house, and she only wanted to know whether they'd ever reached the person they were meant for. Beatrix said no letters had ever come to this house. Mrs. Ashbury said she'd placed them directly into the hands of the security guard across the street. Ozzie said he'd received both of them, delivered both of them, and both times someone had signed for them. Beatrix asked who had signed. Ozzie said the person who signed was sitting at this table. Everyone turned. Danica sat motionless, both hands resting in her lap. Piotr asked whether she'd received the letters. Danica didn't answer. He asked again. Mrs. Ashbury said she hadn't come there to accuse anyone. She only needed the truth, because for 2 years she'd believed that silence had been an answer. Marin, sitting at the far end of the table, said that silence hadn't been hers. Danica looked up. She looked at Marin, then at the notebook, then lowered her eyes. She said yes, she'd received them. Piotr asked what she'd done with them. Danica said she'd burned them. Beatrix said the girl was talking nonsense. Danica said she'd burned both letters together, inside the metal tin under her bed, and she'd sat there watching until there was nothing left. The kitchen fell silent. Piotr asked why. Danica didn't answer immediately. Then she spoke in a voice no one in that house had ever heard from her before. She said that when she was 19, she'd applied for an art scholarship in New York. She said she'd spent 4 months on the application, redrawn everything from the beginning, and mailed it herself. She said then her mother found it. She said then it was gone. Beatrix said that had nothing to do with this. Danica said the metal tin belonged to her mother, that her mother had burned something in it first, and Danica had only kept the tin afterward. Beatrix said she'd done it for her. Danica said she'd done it for herself, and she'd told Danica one thing, that Danica was staying behind to run the front of the bakery, because she'd already arranged everything. She turned toward Marin and said that for 2 years she'd believed that if she couldn't have anything, then no one else should either. Marin said, "So you burned my address?" Danica said yes. Marin said 3 people had come looking for her, and none of them had asked for Danica. Danica said no one had ever asked for her. Nothing in that house had ever had her name on it, and she'd turned that into Marin's fault, and she'd been wrong. Mrs. Ashbury said she had the answer she'd come for, and she thanked them, and said she would put all of this into writing. Beatrix asked who she was writing it for. Mrs. Ashbury said, for the person who would be asking her questions the next morning. Then Danica stood up. She walked into the storage room, and everyone followed. She pointed toward the metal cabinet, and said there was one more thing. Beatrix said there were only papers inside. Danica said she'd opened it when her mother sent her to get the birth certificate. Beatrix told her to be quiet. Danica said there was an envelope inside the 3rd box. Beatrix stepped in front of the cabinet door. Piotr told her to move. She said no. He said, "Beatrix, move." And for the first time in 8 years, she moved. Piotr took the key from her apron, opened the cabinet, pulled out the 3rd box, and placed it on the workbench. He opened the lid. On top was the empty space where the 2 identification documents had been removed. Beneath it lay an ivory-colored envelope, sealed shut, never opened. He picked it up. He stared at his late wife's distinct handwriting on the envelope, and his hands began to tremble. Marin said, "That's my mother's handwriting." He tore open the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten pages clipped together with another document bearing a faded notary seal, dated 8 years and 3 months earlier. He read the first line, then dropped heavily into the work chair. Ozzy asked what it said. Piotr handed the paper to Mrs. Ashbury, because his hands could no longer hold it steady. She read it aloud. She read that the entire property, the bakery, and all the equipment inside were the sole property of Helena Kowalczyk, and that she left all of it to her biological daughter, Marin Kowalczyk, with ownership transferring to Marin on the day Marin married, or on the day Marin turned 30 years old, whichever came first. No one spoke. Then Danica made a sound, not quite a cry, almost more like a laugh, and she said, "Mother, what have you done?" Beatrix stood leaning against the storage room doorway. Marin said, "The 17th. Piotr said, "Saturday." Ozzy said, "3 weeks ago." And Mrs. Ashbury placed the document on the table, looked at Beatrix, and said very slowly that she'd lost everything on the exact day she thought she'd won. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the entire Kowalczyk family entered a 4th-floor room in the cold storage building by the harbor, a room containing nothing but 1 long table, 10 chairs, and a recording device placed in the middle of the table. Cormac Delaney stood to greet each of them, invited them to sit, then said clearly and slowly that this was a recorded deposition for the ownership dispute concerning the property at number 42 Locust Point Street, that every word spoken in this room would be recorded, that everyone had the right to remain silent, and everyone had the right to have their own attorney present. Piotr asked whom he represented. Delaney said he represented the creditor. Beatrix asked who the creditor was. Delaney said that question would be answered before the session ended. Then he opened the side door and invited the witnesses in. The first person to enter was a man about 45 years old, with gray hair at the temples. He sat down and introduced himself as Hollis Weatherby. The second was Dr. Noel Ashbury. The third was Ozzy Brennan, carrying the hard-covered notebook in his hands. The fourth came in last, wearing a gray coat, carrying nothing, and sat down without looking at anyone. Theodora Vance. Beatrix looked at each of them in turn, from left to right, and Delaney remained silent until she'd finished looking at all 4. Then she spoke aloud, and her voice no longer carried its usual calm. She said, "I know every single one of these faces." Delaney asked whether she could repeat that for the recorder. Beatrix lowered her head and whispered, "I know all 4 of them, and I turned every single one away." Delaney thanked her and wrote 1 line on the papers in front of him. Then he questioned each witness. He asked Weatherby when he'd come to the Kowalczyk home and why. Weatherby said August of the previous year, to ask for Marin Kowalczyk, because he was looking for the person who baked a certain kind of dark bread he'd eaten at a cafe and had been told it came from this bakery. Delaney asked whether he'd been able to meet her. Weatherby said no. He'd been told she'd moved to Philadelphia in the spring. Delaney asked who had told him. Weatherby pointed to Beatrix. Delaney questioned Dr. Ashbury. She described the 2 visits, the 2 letters, and said those letters had contained an offer of employment at the hospital cafeteria, with the salary and terms written clearly inside. Marin, sitting at the far end of the table, looked up for the first time. Delaney questioned Ozzy. Ozzy placed the hard-covered notebook on the table and said every date was in there. Then he read 3 entries. Only 3. 2 signatures acknowledging receipt of the letters, and 1 line recording Delaney's own 11-minute visit. Delaney thanked him. Then he turned to Vance. He asked what day she'd gone to that house and in what capacity. Vance said October 6th, and that she'd gone there as someone who'd been hired. Delaney asked who had hired her. Vance said she would answer that later, when everyone who needed to be present was in the room. Beatrix stared at her for a long time. Delaney said, "All right, let the record reflect that the witness was reserving her answer." Then he asked Beatrix a single question. He asked how many times during the past 2 years she'd answered on Marin Kowalczyk's behalf when someone came looking for her. Beatrix said she hadn't counted. Delaney said 4. Beatrix asked why he was asking if he already knew. Delaney said he was asking so the recorder could hear her answer. Piotr had remained silent from the beginning. He hadn't touched the glass of water in front of him. Then he said he wanted to make a statement. Delaney asked what he wanted to state. Beatrix said he had nothing to say. Piotr said, "I do." Beatrix turned toward him and whispered something into his ear, and Marin, seated at the far end of the table, couldn't hear it, but she saw Beatrix's lips form exactly 3 words. The drawer. Piotr heard her. He sat still for about 5 seconds. Then he said aloud, clearly enough for the recorder, "That drawer you're talking about. I'm going to open it myself now." He said that 8 years earlier, 4 months after his wife died, he'd taken the property documents and used the premises as collateral for a loan. He said the property wasn't in his name, it was in his wife's name. He said he needed her signature for the bank to accept it. He said he'd forged her signature. The room fell absolutely silent. Delaney asked whether he understood what he'd just admitted. Piotr said he did. Delaney asked whether he understood the consequences. Piotr said he'd understood them for 8 years, every morning of those 8 years, and that was why for 8 years he hadn't dared say a single thing in his own house. He turned toward Beatrix and said she'd kept that paper, and she'd reminded him of it every time he was about to open his mouth. He said every time the girl was made to stand outside the back door, all Beatrix had to do was say 3 words, and he sat back down. He said, "I sold my daughter with my silence, a little at a time, every day, for 8 years." Delaney asked why he was speaking now. Piotr looked toward the far end of the table, looked at Marin, and said because yesterday he'd read his wife's handwriting for the first time in 8 years, and in those pages she'd left everything to the girl, and if he remained silent for 1 more day, his testimony wouldn't be worth anything to anyone. He said he knew that speaking would cost him everything. He said he'd lost everything a long time ago. Delaney nodded and wrote it down. Beatrix sat very straight, both hands resting on the table, and she didn't say another word. Delaney looked at the clock, then said there was still 1 more person coming in, and that person would answer the question, Mrs. Kowalczyk had asked at the beginning of the session. Beatrix asked who. Delaney said the creditor, and the door at the end of the room opened. The door at the far end of the room opened, and the man in the wheelchair came in, but he wasn't pushing himself alone. 2 men walked beside him, 1 on each side, and both stopped at the threshold once he was fully inside. One closed the door. The other stood in front of it. Beatrix shot to her feet. Danica lifted a hand to her mouth. Piotr stared, and he didn't recognize him at first, because in 4 months he'd never once taken a close look at that man. August stopped his chair at the far end of the table, facing them. Delaney rose from the chair at the head of the table and moved to sit off to one side, and the gesture was small, but everyone in the room saw it. He said for the recorder that the man who had just entered was Mr. August Reinhold, owner of Helena Cold Storage and Freight, the creditor in this case. The man standing at the door added 1 sentence, not for the recorder but for everyone in the room, saying that from this moment on, the boss spoke first. Beatrix said that was impossible. August told her to sit down, because today was going to be a long day. She sat. He looked around the table once, pausing on Marin a little longer than the others, and then he began to speak, and he spoke without stopping. No one interrupted him, and the only sounds left in the room were his voice and the recorder running. He said, "My name is August Reinhold, and 8 years ago that name had 37 trucks and 4 cold storage warehouses standing behind it." He said, "I was 35 years old. I controlled 2 western gates at this port, and I trusted 3 men." He said, "One evening in February, those 3 men drove me away in a truck that belonged to my own company, and they left me in the middle of the road in the Fort Avenue area, about 1.5 miles from here." He said, "They took my wallet, my papers, even my watch, not because they needed them, but so that if anyone found me, they wouldn't know who I was." He said, "It was bitterly cold, and cars passed by. Some slowed down, but none of them stopped, because in that neighborhood, people knew that when a man was lying in the middle of the road at midnight, there was usually a reason for it, and getting involved in that reason meant trouble." He said, "I lay there for about 4 hours. He said, "When I woke up, I was somewhere warm, lying on sacks of flour, and the first thing I realized wasn't that I was still alive, it was that my legs no longer obeyed me." He said, "The person who dragged me inside was a woman who baked bread on the night shift, alone, and she was much smaller than I was, and to this day I don't understand how she managed to pull me across that threshold." He said, "She kept me hidden in the back storage room for 6 weeks, while her daughter was away visiting family for the summer." He said, "She didn't call the police, didn't call a hospital, didn't ask me a single question about the 3 men, and twice, When people came around the neighborhood asking questions, she told them she lived alone. He said, she bought medicine with her own money, and I know for a fact it was her money, because I saw the household ledger sitting on the table, and I knew exactly how much a small bakery had left at the end of each week. He said, every night after she finished baking, she sat down and changed my bandages, and she did it before she slept, which meant she slept less than 3 hours a day for 6 straight weeks. He said, by the 4th week I could sit up, and I told her I would pay her. I said I would pay 10 times over, 100 times over, any number she wanted, and at that point I still had enough people left to get that money back. He said, she wouldn't take a single cent. He said, I asked her why, and she gave me only 5 words, and those 5 words were, take it, don't tell anyone. He said, I heard those words in the 1st week when she handed me the first loaf of bread, and I heard them again in the 6th week when she gave me bus fare so I could leave. He said, her name was Helena Kowalczyk. In the room, Piotr raised both hands and covered his face. August said, during the final week, before I left, she gave me a sealed envelope. He said, she told me not to open it. He said, she told me not to open it unless one day I heard that she was gone. He said, I asked her why she was giving it to me, a man she'd dragged in off the street whose real name she didn't even know, and she said she'd seen 2 men searching for me around the neighborhood. She'd watched the way they walked, the way they asked questions, and she told me, I don't know who you are, but I know you're not a man who can do nothing. He said, she was right. He said, I left Baltimore. I was gone for 6 years. And for those 6 years I did one thing. I took back everything. One piece at a time. He said, none of the 3 men who were in that truck that night work at this port anymore. And I took everything back from them with papers, with contracts, with courts, because during those 6 weeks when I was lying on sacks of flour, I promised that woman that if I ever managed to get back on my feet, I wouldn't walk the same road that had put me on the ground. He said, I kept that promise, and it was the hardest promise I've ever kept. He said, when I built my own company, I named it after her, and for 8 years I never once went back to Locust Point, because I didn't think I had earned the right to stand at her door. He said, 2 years into my recovery, I tried to search for her from afar, but the records showed she had passed away shortly after I left 8 years ago, and all I could ever send back was a gravestone. He said, that was the day I opened the envelope. He reached inside his coat, took out a sheet of paper that had yellowed with age, unfolded it, and began to read, and his voice slowed. He read, I have a daughter. He read, please don't give her money. He read, give her someone who asks what she thinks. He folded the paper again. He said, I have 400 people. I have 11 companies. And for 2 years I read those 3 lines hundreds of times without being able to use a single thing I had. He said, because she didn't ask for money, and money was the only thing I knew how to give. He said, I still didn't fully understand those 3 lines until the night I sat at the end of the street and watched a young woman carry the trash out through the back alley at 7 o'clock in the evening. He said, I didn't come to save anyone. He said, I came to do the one thing her mother told me to do, and it was something so small that for 30 years no one in this room had been willing to do it. He looked directly at Beatrix and said, that thing was to ask her one question. At noon that day, everyone returned to Locust Point Street, and Delaney said he wanted to finish this exactly where it had begun, on the sidewalk in front of the bakery, where 3 weeks earlier a strip of ribbon had still hung across the doorway. The neighbors gathered again, this time in greater numbers than before. Delaney took out the agreement, relinquishing family rights, and read every line aloud, including the amount of $500, then told the entire street that the document had no legal value whatsoever. Beatrix asked why. Delaney said because a person could only buy back an interest that person actually owned, and this property had never belonged to her for even a single day. He added that the important thing wasn't that the document was invalid, but that it existed at all. He said people didn't pay money to buy something they truly believed didn't exist. He said the fact that she'd had this document prepared exactly 3 days before the wedding proved that she knew there was an interest waiting for someone to claim it. Beatrix said he couldn't prove that, and Danica stepped forward. She placed her mother's phone in Delaney's hand, already unlocked, and said there were messages inside from September. There was the call from Thursday night, and there was a name she didn't recognize. Delaney looked through it, then handed the phone to Vance, and Vance nodded and said that was the person who had hired her. Beatrix turned toward her daughter and asked what she was doing. Danica said, "I'm giving back something that was never mine." Beatrix said she was losing everything. Danica said she knew. She said she was losing her home, losing her job, losing her mother. But she said she was keeping one thing. Beatrix asked what. Danica said, "The way I can look at myself in the mirror in the morning." Then she stepped back out of the crowd and stood alone at the edge of the sidewalk. She didn't cry. She simply stood there with empty hands. Marin looked at her for a long time. Then she called Danica's name. Danica turned around. Marin said, "Come stand beside me." Danica asked why she would do that. Marin said because for 2 years, 3 people had come to this door, and not one of them had asked Danica a single question, and she'd sat in the kitchen and listened when Danica said that, and she remembered. She said, "No one ever came looking for you, but I'm asking now." Danica stood still for about 5 seconds, then walked over, and when she took her place beside her sister, the entire street fell silent. That afternoon, Pyotr walked down to the end of the street. He went alone, carrying nothing, and he walked all 40 steps to the red brick wall where August was sitting. He stopped 2 paces away. August asked who he'd come looking for. Pyotr said he'd come looking for his daughter. August asked what her name was. Pyotr fell silent. August said he only needed to say one name. Pyotr opened his mouth, and this time no one called him from inside the house. No one mentioned the drawer, and there was nothing left for him to fear, because he'd already lost everything that morning. He said, "Marin." Then he said, "My daughter's name is Marin Kowalczyk." And August planted both hands on the armrests of his chair and pushed himself upward. It took him about 10 seconds. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't beautiful. His face went pale and both arms trembled, but he got to his feet, and he stood upright, and he listened to that name while standing. Then he lowered himself back into the chair, breathed for a while, and said, "I've waited 8 years to hear someone in that house say her name." Pyotr said, "I lost 8 years before I could say it." August said, "Then both of us traveled the same distance." Then he reached inside his coat and took out a stack of papers, held them up where everyone could see, and said, "This is the entire debt of Mr. Pyotr Kowalczyk." He asked for a match. Ozzy gave him one. August struck it and set the papers on fire right there on the sidewalk, in front of everyone. And he held them until they were almost completely burned before letting them fall. Pyotr asked why he'd done that. August said, "Because the debt I carry is greater than the debt you carry, and mine was forgiven first." 7 days later, the bakery opened again. The old sign was taken down and a new one was hung in its place, painted by hand, bearing only one word, Helena's. On Tuesday morning, the neighborhood children once again lined up outside, with coins clenched tightly in their hands, because Tuesday was honey bread day, and this time the person who came out to hand them their bread was the same person who had baked it. Marin stood behind the front counter, in the exact place she'd been forbidden to stand for 8 years. Danica worked with her, in the back, learning how to divide the dough. Pyotr swept the yard every morning without anyone telling him to. And when August rolled his chair up to the bakery door at the end of that day, Marin wrapped a still warm loaf, placed it in his hands, and said the same 5 words her mother had said to him 8 years earlier. She said, "Take it, don't tell anyone." This story leaves us with something very simple, that kindness is never truly lost. It only travels a long road before finding its way back to the right address. And sometimes it returns after 8 years. Sometimes it returns after the person who gave it is no longer here, but it always returns. That a person's name is something no one has the right to take away, and that a real family isn't a place where people simply share the same last name, but a place where they are still willing to call one another by name. That one kind question, just one, can change the entire life of someone who has been forgotten for far too long. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to compelling stories every day, and share it with someone you believe may need to hear it today. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please leave a comment below and tell us what remained in your heart after hearing it. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.